Adventures in Grace, episode number 19.
You know, the word gospel means good news. In fact, it means such incredible good news that it makes a man leap for joy.
Following Jesus, being a Jesus follower, is not trying to be like him. It's allowing him to be himself in the uniqueness of our own personhood.
The whole idea of gospel is that this is a public announcement about something that has happened, as a result of which the whole world is a different place.
Well, hello, my friends. Welcome back to Adventures in Grace. My name is Brandon Vaughn, and this is the podcast dedicated to knowing the depths of the unconditional love of God. My goal is to help you know of God's amazing covenant love towards you and to realize that practically in day-to-day life. So good to have you here with me. We are continuing our study through Malcolm Smith's book, The Secret of the Lost Covenant, the Lost Secret of the New Covenant, or the Power of the New Covenant. We are in chapter 11, which is talking about the covenant meal. And we only have a couple of chapters left. It goes through chapter 17. So we have a little over a month left in this study, and we'll almost 2 months, and we'll get into this. Today we are talking about the covenant meal. Now, if you didn't hear my podcast from last week, I would definitely encourage you to go back and listen to that, because the covenant meal, the Eucharist, communion, all this stuff relates back a lot to what I talked about last week. And I went into a lot of details to talk about baptism and what's the purpose of baptism. Why do we need it? The fact that it doesn't make anything happen, but it is a physical representation that brings to you in the immediate now, in the physical dimension, the reality of the invisible. It brings to you those things, very much like birthday cakes brings to the physical the celebration of a birthday, or a wedding ring brings into the physical reality the invisible reality of being spiritually in union. You don't need a wedding ring, but man, how wonderful it is to be able to celebrate in this physical dimension a union with someone by wearing a ring. It is amazing, and it's a beautiful way of doing this. And we went into a lot of detail about that. I gave an example of a cop and a badge, how wearing a badge doesn't make you a cop, but if you put on a badge and a uniform, it's amazing how people suddenly do things like stop in traffic if you're out in the road. I've seen people out in roads that weren't in uniform and badge, and what did people do? They honked at them, they screamed at them, they screamed obscenities to them. Get out of the road, you stupid moron. You know, this is what happens when people do stuff like that. But you put on a uniform and a badge, and suddenly people don't shout, obscenities to that person anymore. That person puts up their hand, and what do? They slam on the brakes. They stop. Now, the uniform and the badge didn't make that happen. It was the authority of that. That was just a physical representation of something in the invisible realm. And it's an amazing, wonderful thing that we have available to us. I love the fact that we can hug people and kiss people and wear rings, and we can have cake and celebrate and give gifts and do all this type of stuff. I love that kind of stuff. And it just is a wonderful gift that we have to make the invisible into a physical dimension. It doesn't make it happen, doesn't make it real, but it's all a part of what it means to be human. You're around friends. It's amazing to be able to go out and eat with them and share a meal with them. It doesn't make you friends, but it's an amazing ability to interact with people and to make that invisible friendship into a very physical, tangible thing. So Malcolm in his book talks about the idea of the covenant meal, or the Eucharist, and he says in his book, he says, "We gather with our people, this company of lost prodigals now found, forgiven, made new, and crazy with joy at the thought of his love, to worship and give him thanks. In our gathering and encouraging one another, the Spirit is present, establishing us in the reality and causing the unreality to increasingly be seen for what it is. At the center of this worship is the meal of the covenant, where we meet with the eternal God, partake of his death, conquering life, are embraced by his love, and participate in the covenant promises. It is known by many names: the Holy Communion, the Eucharist, which basically just means Thanksgiving, the Lord's Supper, or the Mass. But he says, tragically, this meal has been the battleground of believers through the centuries. For many, it is the most misunderstood practice of the Christian faith. In many seeker-friendly churches, it has been marginalized and nearly forgotten. In conversations with many charismatic and evangelical pastors, I've realized that they do not know what to do with the meal. They intuitively know that it is important and cannot do away with it, but they do not know what it means or where it fits. So it becomes an awkward postscript to the programs of the church. This meal is at the heart of the covenant. Misunderstanding here has repercussions throughout the Christian life. So again, this is another very controversial topic, but it's a very important topic. And again, please go back to my previous episode and listen to where I talk about symbols and why we need physical symbols in this spiritual walk. It doesn't make things happen. It's not magic, but we as physical beings, spiritual physical beings, need the physical to help us, to make things tangible and real to us. It doesn't make it real, but it does something very unusual for us. It helps us. It's an aid for us. And yet I find in most churches that the first two things that get thrown out in the Christian world and in churches are baptism and the Lord's Supper or communion, or it's marginalized. I was in one church one time where they would do it periodically, and it would just be a table and you could just go up there and participate in, or, I've seen one church where people would be lined up and there would be people on their cell phones and making calls and texting people while it happened. And a place that I go to regularly now to help and do some teaching, I'm not in any state to where I can kind of dictate what's done there in terms of policies and things like that, but pretty much this whole communion aspect is done maybe once a year. It's just we don't know what to do with it, and so basically people don't do anything with it, and they marginalize it quite a bit. But if you go back to the earliest church, and I would encourage you to read some of the early church fathers, especially before 400 AD. I would go back into the early period of time, the disciples of the disciples, or the disciples of the disciples of the disciples and apostles, and really read what they say, and you will see that this covenant meal is at the heart of the early church. They basically based their whole service around it. And I love that. The early church, basically the center of the church gathering was this table. It was this meal. And that was why they were there. It was to celebrate this covenant union. And if there was any teaching and things like that, lectures, that was off to the side. And even in the earliest churches, they built up through the centuries, the table was always in the center of the church. And any kind of podium or lecture place was off to the side somewhere, because that's an aside of why we're here. We're here to celebrate our union, our covenant union with God. And this is where we're going to do that. This is going to be our focal point. This is going to be the symbol that brings to us this reality, that's going to bring into the physical dimension this reality of this invisible reality. And throughout the years, you'll notice that what happens is that the pulpit or the lectern starts becoming more into the center. And back 10, 20, 30 years ago, the table was moved below the lectern. The lecture podium was elevated up on a stage as being the central focus of the church. The communion table was often below that. And now in modern churches, that table's just gone. We've just totally removed it, and now the podium is there. It's become the front and the center of everything. So if you go back again to our definition of covenant, and go back to the episode where I talk about covenant, and I believe that's Adventures in Grace, episode number 9. So if you go to adventuresingrace.com/09, I believe that is where we talked about what happens when you make covenant. And part of the covenant, after the blood has been shed, the oath has been made, all this type of stuff, the covenant representatives would sit down and celebrate the covenant with a meal. And go back and listen to this episode. And one of the foundation parts of almost all covenant meals, I mean, they might have barbecue and who knows, what they might have, but the core of the covenant meal was bread and wine. That was always part of the covenant meal. And when they made covenant, they did all this, and they had all these physical, tangible ways, but they still celebrated it by food. And I think there's a point there, because when we shed blood and we mingled the blood by putting our hands or our wrists together, that was one thing. Our bloods are now mingled. But there was a sense in which you are now part of me so much that you're like inside of me. We're one that way. And how can we picture that? How can we celebrate that in a physical way? Because I can't eat you. I can't merge you into my body any more than what we did through the blood. So then comes this amazing meal. And we eat this bread, and we say, in this bread is me. And I give myself to you in covenant. This is the reality of what's happened. All that I am is yours. And so when you eat this bread, it's like you're eating me. It's like you are tangibly, physically taking me inside of you. This is the union that I have in covenant with you. We are that one with each other that when you eat this, it's like you're eating me. It's like you're partaking of me, because this is what really has happened in our covenant. And then we come around to this wine, and we say, we mingled our bloods together, but our blood is so one now that it's like my blood is your blood. So as you drink this wine, let it be in celebration that I am bound to you by blood. This is my blood that I give to you. In other words, we are so bound now in covenant, I'll shed my blood for you. My blood is yours, and I give you my blood. If it comes to the point that I die, I will die to keep my covenant to you. If it means the shedding of my blood, I will keep my word to you. And how do we celebrate that? How do we make that a reality? Well, one, we've mingled our bloods, but now we take this wine and we drink it. And we say, when I drink this, it's like I'm drinking you and I'm drinking your blood, which I know sounds kind of odd and it sounds kind of barbaric maybe in some ways, but this is how serious our covenant is. We're saying that when you drink this, it's like you're drinking my blood because my blood is going to be shed for you. Does that make sense? I mean, because we read these statements that Jesus makes and it sounds weird to us. Eat my flesh and drink my blood. And we say, how gross. That's just absurd. But when you understand it in covenant terms, it makes a lot of sense because this is describing the covenant that everything I am, my body, I give to you. And I will keep this covenant even if it means the shedding of my blood. So by eating this bread and drinking this wine, we are celebrating that covenant in a physical, tangible way. Yes, it's just bread. Yes, it's just wine. Yes, it's just a wedding ring. Yes, it's just a badge. But yet it's something more than that. It's not magic, but it's a symbol representing the reality. So I eat this bread and I drink this wine, and it's in a very physical way. I'm celebrating this reality, and it helps me as a person. So many people want to feel God, to feel connected to God. And yet I look at church and we've pushed out the very thing that will help you. Because when you eat something, you can physically feel that in your mouth as you're chewing it and as you're swallowing it. Same thing with wine or grape juice in some churches. You drink that and you can feel yourself drinking this. And that is a physical connection point that you realize when I do this, I'm doing this in celebration of who God is and what God has done on my behalf in covenant. I'm not making it happen. This is not magic. But yet at the same time, by me doing this, it is in a new way, in the now moment, connecting me to that reality in ways I don't want to even try to describe. I don't want to make this a scientific experiment. I don't want to get into the arguments of does it change into something or not. This is representing something bigger than itself. A wedding ring is bigger than itself. It doesn't make people married, but yet it has some power to it. I don't get it fully, but it does. Same thing with bread and wine. Now, it's interesting if you go into Genesis 18, and when God appeared to Abraham, and what did Abraham do? If you go into the very first verses, it says that Abraham ran from his tent to greet these men that were coming, which is basically God coming. It's interesting that he saw 3 men standing there, and it says very clearly that God appeared to Abraham. So this is God appearing to Abraham, but he chooses to appear to Abraham as 3 men. So Abraham ran from his tent to greet them. He said, Master, if it please you, stop for a while with your servant. I'll get some water so you can wash your feet. Rest under this tree. I'll get some food to refresh you on your way since your travels have brought you across my path. And they said, certainly go ahead. So Abraham hurried into his tent to Sarah. He said, hurry up, get 3 cups of our best flour, knead it, and make bread. Then Abraham ran to the cattle pen, picked out the nice plump calf, gave it to the servant. Then he got curds and milk, brought them to the calf, roasted, set the meal before the men, and stood under the tree while they ate. So in there, it's very interesting that when God comes to meet with Abraham, Abraham feeds them food. Food is a celebration point, as we said last week. We celebrate birthdays, and we eat, and we drink, and we celebrate with people. They get a job. We go out and celebrate by going out to dinner with people. Anniversaries, we go out and we eat. Again, in times of strife and trouble, somebody dies and we're mourning, we bring food and we eat with people. And it's not in celebration. There's something interesting about how food is connected to what we do. I mean, have you ever thought about how everything in life revolves around food? We go out and we make a business deal with someone, and what do we usually do? We try to get them to go to dinner with us. We eat dinner with them. Like we said with birthday parties and parties in general, we have food and we feed people. What is it about food? Why do we need food to do stuff like this? There's something about food, and I think it goes all the way back to covenant, because food was the center of covenant. It was the end result of covenant. It was the final celebration of covenant. Go back into Exodus 12, and I'm not going to read all of Exodus 12 today, but go back and study Exodus 12, because in Exodus 12, we have the Passover meal, in which the Israelites ate a meal a Passover meal before they were delivered. And I find that fascinating again, that in this festival of unraised bread, the leaven and all this kind of stuff, that they actually ate a meal. And I find that fascinating that God says, when you celebrate this moving forward, you will eat this meal. And this is going to be in celebration of how I delivered you. Why? Why eating a meal? Why couldn't God said, you're going to get outside and wave flags, or you're going to go outside and just kind of look up at the stars and count them, and then I'm going to deliver you, and then you'll go out and you'll look up at stars. No, I want you to eat. This is how you're going to do this. You're going to go eat, and then I'm going to deliver you, and then the way you're going to celebrate that moving forward is you're going to eat. You're going to have a meal, and you're going to celebrate what I did by eating this meal and keeping this festival. Then you go over to Exodus 24, and it's talking about the covenant being made, the law given, and we'll talk about the law at some point in the future, but you go into verse 9, and this is from the Message, Exodus 24, verse 9. It says, "Then they climbed the mountain," that's Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, if I said that right, 70 of the elders of Israel, and saw the God of Israel. They are meeting with the God of Israel. He was standing on a pavement of something like sapphires, pure, clear sky blue. He didn't hurt these pillar leaders of the Israelites. Then it says this, they saw God, and they ate and drank. It makes it very clear that when they met with God, that they ate and they drank. Isn't it interesting that this is the very center or the celebration of covenant? It is in this covenant meal. It's in the Passover meal. It is in the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, that to celebrate what God has done, we do that by bread and wine. We do that by eating and drinking. So understanding covenant, understanding that I give my life to you, that I will shed my blood for you, and now we're going to eat bread and we're going to drink wine in celebration of this. You're going to actually eat this, and when you're doing this, you know you're in union with me. It's not magic. It's just making it very tangible for you. Does it now make more sense when Jesus says this in Luke 22, verses 19 through 20? "And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you.'" And as we've seen, this expression, new covenant in my blood, is better understood as the new covenant ratified or validated in my blood. It was a meal that declared the coming into being of the new covenant with all of its promises. And Malcolm goes on to say this in his book. He says, "Upon first hearing, it sounds strange to our ears to be commanded to eat bread and wine in order to remember him. It does not sound like a spiritual activity. It's too physical. It's too disconnected from our ideas of what one should do to remember and draw close to him. To remember him is understood by many as a spiritual or mental pursuit, and therefore would best be pursued by a Bible study or a convention that expounds the deeper Christian life, or at least a prayer meeting. Where do a table with a white cloth, a chalice of wine, and a piece of bread fit into this? It doesn't make any sense to us. But yet this is the celebration of covenant, constantly in covenant. Have you ever noticed this in Psalm 23? Very popular psalm. We know this, many of us, by heart. The Lord is my shepherd. And have you ever thought what it says in the end, verses 5 through 6? You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And Malcolm says this in his book, has it ever struck you a little odd that the climax of the psalm is in David's eating with his divine shepherd? The psalm reaches its climax with God and man eating a holy meal of victory, for his enemies look on but are defeated and afraid to attack in the presence of the shepherd. His head is anointed with oil, which is always a symbol of the Holy Spirit's coming upon us, and his cup of covenant blessing overflows. The last verse describes him being pursued by mercy, and again, the word is hesed, the steadfastness, love of the covenant. So in the middle of the psalm, he says that God sets a table. In other words, we're going to eat together, and we're eating in covenant, celebration of the covenant that God has toward me. So a key part of all of this that we need to come to grasp with is this word remember. Do this in remembrance of me. And because this is a fault of our Western mindsets. We don't get what the word remember means. It's, again, a very covenant term that when we do this, we're doing it in remembrance of him. Now, I'm going to read quite a bit from Malcolm's here because he does such a tremendous job of explaining this. And of course, if you have the book, you can just read this. But I'm going to read basically almost a whole page, almost 2 pages of this, of what he says about the word remember. He says, to understand the meal, we have to understand the word remember. The question I wrestled with as a young believer was how we could do this remembrance of me when we had not even been there 2,000 years ago. Remembering surely means thinking about and reconstructing an event in the past. I did not see how we could think about and reconstruct the events of his death and resurrection when we had not been there. It would be like saying to someone, do you remember that vacation we had in Hong Kong when I had not even been with this person at Hong Kong at all? His question would make me ask if he was senile. The only way I could make sense of it was to take out the word remember and substitute the word imagine. And I can attest to this. I'm not reading from the book anymore. Many people, when they say, do this in remembrance of me, that we try to imagine the death of Christ, that we imagine what it was like, or we do something like that. That's what we think. Surely remembering being impossible, I was left to imagine what his suffering and death must have been like. But I knew that was not the answer, and I was left confused and frustrated. The word remember had a totally different meaning to the people of both the Old and the New Testament than it is to us in the Western world in the 21st century. In one sense, the word meant the same to them as it does to us. It meant and means remember. The vast difference in meaning is in how that remembering is achieved, the kind of activity that is understood to be going on when the word is used. Remember in the West, in our modern times, describes a mental activity, a recall of an event with the mind, to think about a past event. It describes the mental exercise of digging around the cobwebs of memory to put together again that vacation in Hong Kong, assuming you were there. If that is what the word meant to Jesus and those disciples around the table with him, then at best the meal was meant to be a rather strange aid to their devotional imagination. But his words could only truly be obeyed by these men gathered around the table, for they were the only ones there who could at a future time cast their minds back and remember. In other words, the only ones who could really, truly remember if it's a mental activity were the people that were there with Jesus, because then the people that come after that weren't there at the table with Jesus, so they can't really remember that. They weren't there. They weren't physically there with Jesus. So Malcolm goes on to say this, but to the Greek and Hebrew mind of the first century, remember describes something totally different. First, it was not only a mental activity, a thinking about a past event, but an activity of the whole person, spirit, mind, emotion, and body. Second, it meant to do the past event, not merely to think about it. To remember meant to recreate the past event, bringing it into the present moment by reenacting it, employing rituals and symbols to do so. Third, to remember meant that the persons remembering totally identified with and participated in all the powers and effects of the original event. Every year, the people of God in the Old Testament remembered their deliverance from Egypt in exactly this fashion, reenacting it in the Passover meal. So what Malcolm is referring to there, if you go back into Exodus, we read this earlier, and God says, remember the Passover and keep it. What did they do? They didn't think about it. They actually did it. And you can read how they would go out and live in tents sometime to physically do again what they did in the past. They would eat the meal again. They would go through they would physically do it. They would reenact it. They would bring it back into the present moment. And this is how they remembered. They didn't think about it. They did it. So Malcolm goes on and says this, remembering could be understood as a bridge in time that effectively brought the past into the present, almost a kind of time warp. It was a dramatically played out, you are there, so that even if you had not been at the original event, you immediately encountered it and participated in it. The emphasis was on the doing again the past event, not merely thinking about it, which explains the word of Jesus, do this in remembrance of me, not merely think this about me. Let me try to sum that up in a working definition. Remembering is never to be understood as thinking about the past. It is always an active participation in the historical reality of the past by reenacting it, and in so doing realizing the powers released in that past in such a way as to shape the present moment. This definition of remember means that at the celebration of the holy meal, we do not look back to the cross and empty tomb. In this remembrance, his finished work is brought forward into the present moment, even as he in his glory is uniquely here, present with us in this rite. We receive in the present moment all of the effects of the covenant. In this now moment, we rejoice in our redemption achieved, that the burden of sin and guilt has been sent away from us, and we are now declared righteous in Christ. We glory in our deliverance from the domain of darkness and in the eternal life that we are partaking of. All the terms, promises, and blessings of the covenant are here now in this present moment and released to us by the Spirit in the meal of remembering. Malcolm says it might help us to understand the two ways of thinking using a wedding as an example. If I were say to a Western couple, let's remember your wedding, the response would be a mental reconstruction of the event, groping through the memories for the guest list, the minister who performed the ceremony, what happened at the celebration afterwards, and so on. If I said the same thing to any couple of the New Testament days, the response would be, let's do it. It would be the only response that would be capable of making, for remembering to them was a matter of doing, not only thinking. They would go back to the synagogue where they had been married, or one that was much the same, try to find the rabbi who had married them, and invite as many of the guests who had been there as possible. If the original guests were not available, the couple's present friends would be able to join right in, because in this remembering, one did not have to be at the original event. It would be recreated in rite and symbol. Of course, the couple would not get married a second time, but the original vows would be renewed in a new depth and mature love. All of the powers of the original wedding would be present at this reenactment and renewal. Thus we see that Jesus was saying, reenact this meal, do it again. In whatever moment of time you are, this moment will be present to you. You will be here at the ratification of the new covenant and immediately present to me, the mediator of the new covenant. Now, I just got to say, wow. I don't know about you, but that is some amazing words, and words that I honestly weren't raised around. It was very foreign to me to think this way, to realize that when we're talking about covenant, God establishing covenant with us, that he gives us a way to celebrate that, a way to make it physically tangible to us. Doesn't make it anything. It's there. It's a reality. We're in covenant. But at this moment of time, I want to know God, and I want to know this covenant, and I have a very physical, people are always, I want to feel goosebumps. I want to feel God. I want to feel this. And I'm saying, you can feel God. Eat this bread, and as you're chewing, you'll feel yourself chewing the bread, and you'll feel yourself swallowing the bread, and guess what? You're in celebration of covenant. You are reenacting what is happening in the inside, and God has given you this amazing picture that is more than a picture. It's really helping you grasp in the spirit something of a reality of this covenant. It's helping you. It's aiding you, and do it. It's a party. You go into Corinthians, and Paul talks about the early church in the Corinthians about how some people would get drunk at the Lord's Supper. And that's amazing to me, because whatever they were doing in this remembering, it was more of a celebration. It was almost like a party, it seems, because people were getting drunk at it. And so it wasn't quite like what I see in most churches, where it seems like a funeral service. And it's this morbid thing where you self-reflect about how unworthy you are. No, it's none of that. It's not about how worthy you are. This is a remembrance of what he did. It's a remembrance of the covenant that he established. And now you are bringing into your present moment the reality of that. And folks, to me, that's a party. That's not a morbid scene. This is a way of remembering. And yes, you analyze. Why do you analyze yourself? Because you want to align yourself with that truth. It's not beating up on yourself and saying, I'm just such a worm and God's... No, it's none of that. You analyze yourself because, are you living according to that? Do you have faith in his covenant faithfulness? Or are you depending on yourself? Are you depending upon your works and your efforts? Or are you resting in his covenant faithfulness? And you should reflect in that when you take of the Lord's meal, because this is a celebration of what he has done, not what you are doing. So I hope that helps. Again, we've talked about kind of two very controversial topics in the last two episodes, baptism and the Lord's Supper, and churches split over these issues. So I hope that it's been encouraging to you, that you've seen this in a new light that you've never seen before, that it's a celebration point. It's not a legalism thing. It's not a condemnation thing. It's a thing of saying, wow, you have this available to you, then use it. It would be very much, again, I don't want to cheapen what baptism and the Eucharist are to us, but it'd be like living right next door to the most awesome baker ever, and you're celebrating somebody's birthday. Why on earth would you not utilize that baker to make it one of the most awesome birthday parties ever, because of this amazing cook that lives beside you? So if you're wanting to connect with God, why not use the very things that have established covenant, that have celebrated covenant, to have a meal with God? You do this with your friends. How awesome it is to go out and celebrate with them by having a meal with them. And you can have a meal with God every week in which he feeds you himself. And he's there. He lives in you. You walk with him 24/7 if you're in him. It doesn't make it happen, but what a wonderful way to physically make it tangible, to bring that invisible into a physical form of celebration and treat it like it was a party celebrating what he has done for you. Well, that's the end of this episode of Adventures in Grace. Hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please consider leaving me some feedback on Stitcher, iTunes, Zune, BlackBerry, however you're listening to me, and let other people know about the show. If you're enjoying this show, if it means something to you, if it's helping you, I would love if you would let other people know about this. So let's pray as we end today. Papa, thank you so much that you've given us a way of celebrating your covenant. It's not magic. We get so bent out of shape about does it change into the actual body and all this. We get into all these silly, crazy arguments and dissect what should be a celebration point. This is our party, our weekly, daily party where we celebrate what you have done. And when we take of this bread and we drink of this wine or this grape juice, that it is a physical celebration of what you've done in the spiritual dimension, that we celebrate in our physical bodies by eating and drinking. We celebrate a meal with you, a meal where you are what it's all about. And you are our bread and you are our wine. You gave yourself to us in a body and blood and established this covenant on our behalf. And we have a chance to celebrate that in this simple act. We thank you for that. I ask that you would encourage all of us, open our eyes to see this and find some way that we can celebrate this in our way and celebrate you in all of your glory. And we ask this in the name, Lord Jesus, so be it. If you have any comments, any questions about this, would love to dialogue with you. Just let me know. If you do have some questions on this, you can leave me comment at my blog, adventuresingrace.com/19. 19 is in episode number 19. Would love to hear from you. You can also leave me voicemail as well, free of charge. Leave me comments. You don't have to sign up. You can also find me on Twitter, Grace Adventure, and you can find me on Facebook by looking up Adventures in Grace as well, and you'll find me on there. Would love to dialogue with you on there as well. So until next time, remember this. Your Papa is crazy about you. He loves you. He likes you. He pursues you relentlessly with goodness and mercy. He sets a table before you in front of your enemies to celebrate through this meal his covenant. He's proud of you. He loves you more than you could ever think or imagine. Now go out today and embrace your life with intention, passion, and purpose, knowing that he will never let you go nor give up on you. Until next time, blessings.